The Scream in the Night, written and narrated by Remy, Militello. Eleanor could not sleep. The air was too thick with humidity, and her skin was too moist from sweat. It was deep into summer, and halfway through a scorching August. That night was one of the hottest nights she could recall in her 5 years of life. The fan on her ceiling spun and spun, gyrating slightly from the force of the rotations. However, her fan provided little relief. It succeeded only in swirling the sweltering air around in her room. The open windows did not assist the child either. The portals drew in equally stifling air into the predominantly pink and purple painted space. She had been able to sleep only in fits and spurts earlier. But the heat had been so oppressive she could never remain asleep for long. She rolled around on her sheets, her comforter getting tangled in her feet. Eleanor pouted and sighed. She felt miserable and sticky. The combination was far worse than merely being miserable, she thought. With dramatic flair, she slapped her hands on the bed. Her tiny palms produced a dull thud against the cozy linens. In frustration, she grunted and kicked her star-speckled comforter to the bottom of her bed, stomping it down like a horse trampling on a snake. The vexed little girl brusquely grabbed her stuffed unicorn. It had been next to her, lying face down and hindquarters up. The horned horse bore a strong resemblance to the unicorns that were caught mid-prance on Ellie's pajamas. She gripped her stuffed friend tightly for a moment, but its soft fuzzy body proved too warm for her small form. After a few more moments of baking, she could handle no more. Ellie flung the plush plaything off of her bed and into the abyss beyond. She stared at her ceiling fan, tired and defeated, yet sleep would not come. As Eleanor lamented her predicament, the little insomniac listened to the lullaby of the fan's dull mechanical whirring. She wondered if her father would read to her if she woke him up. If Ellie explained the situation to him, perhaps he would understand. A tiny spring of hope began to bubble in her, but it was quickly stuffed up. Somewhere in her gut, she knew that more than likely if she bothered her parents, they would merely tell her to go back to her room. Tell her to go back to sleep, as if such a thing were so easy. They would tell her to suffer in the heat and darkness alone, like a big girl. Ellie had been informed many times that big girls had to sleep by themselves, no matter how hot it was. She squeezed her eyes tightly, as if trying to force sleep into them. It was at this moment that she heard a scream rend the air. Eleanor's eyes shot open. The startled child shot up in her bed. Ellie had never heard anything like it before. She had heard Mommy scream when her little brother came, and when Daddy broke his leg at the pool, but this sounded different. The child couldn't articulate the thought, but it sounded inhuman to her. Eleanor carefully swung her legs over the side of her bed closest to the windows. She shoved her feet into slippers that had Ellie embroidered in cursive on the heel. Then she tiptoed as carefully and quietly as her tiny, uncoordinated feet would allow. Ellie knew that she didn't want her parents to hear her up and about. They would certainly order her back to bed if she were caught. She got on her knees and peered out into the front yard. She couldn't see the owner of the scream anywhere. It was too dark to see anything other than the shadows and outlines of what things might be. The only immediate illumination came from the bulb was fixed to the front porch. The street lamps only flickered into and out of existence weakly, as mosquitoes buzzed around the sickly yellow light. She knew for certain that when someone was hurt, you were supposed to help. That was exactly what the people in the stories her father read to her did. Eleanor continued to scan the yard deliberately for her target. A burgeoning resolve to help was growing within the little girl. However, all she could see were the hazy lights in the distance from the street lamp. There was one to the far left and right of her house, boxing in the little property. The poles were roughly 100 yards apart from one another, and cast long yellow cones into the darkness. Their fluorescent domains terminated neatly in large arcs around their respective bases. Unfortunately, they did little to help her identify who was in need. A wall of impenetrable night occupied the space between the two illuminating cones. Eleanor had to help the screamer. When she screamed, she always needed help. It was like the time she had fallen off her bike and began to bleed from her elbow. Her mommy had been there, but whoever was out there was all alone. No mommies in sight. Ellie jumped away from her window abruptly as a giant fluttering moth landed on the screen. She yelped, but quickly covered her mouth, as if she was trying to catch the gasp midair. As her pulse began to slacken, her resolve to help the person in need steeled. Ellie decided she would be like the people in the stories. Eleanor was a big girl, after all, and that meant she had to help. She finally rose off of her knees and began to shuffle toward her closet. The child came to a large, stuffed white tiger that stood sentry in front of her closet. The toy held a regal and proud stance. He was Eleanor's protector. She used to cry for hours when her parents tried to put her to sleep. Her small mind convinced there was something lurking in her closet. However, under the watchful eye of Mr. Cornflakes, Eleanor finally felt safe. She knew without question he could handle anything that had made her closet its home. She gently stroked the tiger on the forehead and leaned in right next to its rounded ear. "It's okay, Mr. Cornflakes. Mommy and Daddy want me to help," she lied to the toy. With some effort, Eleanor slid the great stuffed animal to the side. Then, with the utmost of care, she peeled the door back to reveal a row of hanging clothes. Underneath her wardrobe sat a pink plastic bucket filled with a heap of toys. She gently pawed through the mound. Plastic clacked together as Ellie cajoled and jostled the sea of toys. Her eyes searched in the shadowy shapes for something specific. Eventually, Ellie felt the familiar pliant rubber she was looking for and pulled it out. Ellie pulled her hand free to reveal her flashlight. It was a petite plastic device, wrapped in baby blue and pink rubber. It was topped with a purple butterfly acting as the switch. She gripped it tightly and nodded to her stuffed tiger, signaling to her friend she was ready. With that, she began to tiptoe to the door. Eleanor and her family lived in a ranch-style house. She was keenly aware that her brother's room was parallel to hers. If he should cry, one of her parents would no doubt come trundling from their room down the hall. Ellie knew that she would have to be as quiet as she had ever managed to be. Eleanor reached out and wrapped her small fingers around the steel door handle, brushed to resemble brass. She began to turn the knob slowly, slower than her little fingers had ever moved. After several agonizing moments, the familiar click of the lock chimed to her relief and dismay. Relieved it was about to open, yet certain her parents must have heard such a loud noise. Silently, she began to pull ever so slightly to slide the polished wood over the beige carpet of her room. The bottom of the door brushed against the sinews of her carpet. Without a sound, Eleanor slipped her tiny frame through the opening. With the same precision and concentration, she closed the door. Finally, she issued a sigh of relief as she heard the final tiny click from the handle sliding into place. Eleanor took halting exploratory steps, trying her hardest to not trigger the creaky wooden floorboards. With all the care she could muster, she began shuffling toward the front door. The hall was cast in darkness before the small nightlight. A suffused orange light radiated through the opaque shell covering. Even though Ellie knew the house well, it always felt so strange and alien at night, as if when the sun went down, the halls and rooms took on a sinister life of their own. This analysis was only confirmed when she emerged from the darkness of the hall and into the moonlit kitchen. The lunar diamond in the sky above radiated through the skylight. Every chair, appliance, and decoration appeared to be reaching out toward Eleanor with dark, grabbing fingers. The child's breathing and pulse quickened. Ellie could feel her nerves slipping from her as the shadowy talons reached for her. She took a sidelong glance back at her door. She broke her gaze off and instead drew her blue eyes to the front door. She eyed it with its gold trim and ornate glass panes filling up its center. She clenched her jaw and bit down. Ellie told herself she needed to help. Someone was hurt. Her resolve had been shored up. For now, the terrified child resumed her trek through the moonlit kitchen toward the front door. After a few minutes of dodging shadows, Ellie had at last escaped the reach of the kitchen. Now she stood in the mudroom, surrounded by shoes and boots before the front door. She kicked off her slippers soundlessly and slipped on her sneakers. She hadn't mastered tying her shoes quite yet, but she could pull the laces tight and tuck them into her shoes. And that's exactly what she did. Before she ventured further, Ellie spotted her bike helmet lying on the floor. It sat where Eleanor had tossed it the previous afternoon after riding with her parents. The little girl scooped up the coral-colored helmet and slid it over her messy strands of blonde hair. Ellie figured it would help protect her from whatever lurked in the shadows. What lurked out there, exactly, she couldn't say. But the sturdy foam pressed against her forehead felt reassuring regardless. Now came the most difficult part, opening the front door without her parents hearing. She subconsciously held her breath as she reached for the heavy deadbolt. Eleanor found the metal switch surprisingly hard to turn over. With a grunt, the lock at last let out a loud metallic thunk. Eleanor froze. It sounded like an explosion in Ellie's ears. She was positive she would hear footsteps any second, but none came. Finally, Ellie gradually moved her hand from the lock to the handle. Relief flushed through her, but then was snatched away. As she pushed forward, the door made a familiar but unaccounted-for creaking moan. Ellie panicked and jumped through the open frame. Adrenaline pumped through Eleanor's little heart as she shivered in the night breeze. She took her first step into the yawning blackness before her. Eleanor stumbled on the welcome mat, but caught herself before tumbling over the cement porch. She pulled the door to the frame, but didn't shut it fully for fear of the metallic clunk. Ellie stepped to the edge of the porch and peered out into the dark yard. At night, she felt the small yard was as vast and unknown as a jungle. The sea of grass began after a row of flowers, whose blooms had grown too heavy and were now dilapidated in the dirt. Eleanor could see the dew shining in the moonlight on the grass, and wondered if she could catch any of it. She gazed up at the clear night sky, the moon reigning high and shining brightly amongst the stars. Eleanor pointed the flashlight toward the cracked pathway, and shifted the butterfly up with a click. A beam of white light erupted forth from the end. The light felt powerful in her small, trembling hands. The little torch illuminated the sidewalk below and a small white oval. But beyond that, the darkness still held sway. With several deep breaths, she began to make her way down the porch onto the cement below. Sneakers firmly planted, she took the chin strap on her helmet and clicked it into the other side. Feeling more secure, she took the path one unsure footstep at a time. The child gripped the plastic torch with white knuckles. She kept it close to her chest, as if it were a holy relic that could ward off whatever stalked beyond its clear pale beam. Ellie slowly scanned around her with the light, searching for whoever needed her help, along with any monsters that were lurking out there. She wished Mr. Cornflakes could have come out with her. He would have protected her, but she was on her own. Ellie told herself that she was a big girl, that she could do this. When she had made it about halfway down the driveway, she heard another panicked screech. This time it sounded more desperate and pained. Eleanor stopped in her tracks, frozen with a mix of fear and anxiety. Where did it come from? She spun the light around wildly, but couldn't see anything. In the midst of her swirling frenzy, she began to inch toward the end of the driveway. It was this time she heard the cry once more. This time the pained yowl was closer, yet noticeably weaker. Eleanor stood at the edge of the driveway. Her head darted back and forth in frenzy. She threw the beam of her light wherever she looked with increasing hysteria. Her breath was heavy with fear. She didn't want to be out here anymore. Her palms had begun to sweat profusely. Ellie felt the pull of her home behind her, but then in the midst of her crazed swirling, she caught a glimpse of something brown and furry. Her panic gesticulating ceased at once. Then, the little girl trained her flashlight on the mass in the middle of the gloom-stricken street. She moved into the desert of darkness between the two lampposts. But for her tiny ray of light, Eleanor had become shrouded in the midnight around her. But she failed to notice anything other than the brown fur her light had caught. Ellie caught sight of a tiny chest rising and falling rapidly as she inched closer. Her light caught the creature in its glassy black eye. The beam glinted off the orb like a black diamond. The frightened animal then released another panicked scream, this time more urgent and savage than before. Eleanor's heart was in her throat. It felt as if it were beating in her ears. The rabbit stood on its front legs, but its hind feet would not rise. Even still, it began to attempt to drag itself away from its would-be helper. The fear drained from Eleanor, replaced with a mixture of relief and sorrow. It had just been a rabbit, just like Peter Cottontail, she thought wistfully. Eleanor slowly moved the beam from its tiny, fearful eyes down its lame body. She nearly dropped her light when she saw why the animal cried. The creature's back legs had been crushed nearly flat. Tears began to well in the girl's eyes. She rushed to the maimed creature's side with urgency heretofore unknown by the child. The rabbit's eyes grew wide with terror as Eleanor approached. It pushed itself to its feet once more and began to painfully drag its broken body away from the girl. But it collapsed after pulling itself a few more inches. Eleanor didn't know what to do. Tears rolled down her face. She crouched down to the petrified animal and was beside herself. Eleanor wanted to pet the dying animal, to tell it everything would be all right, but her parents had always been very clear on not playing with wild animals. However, the rabbit didn't seem very wild to her. She reached out to pet the crippled creature with trepidation. Behind her, a set of lights emerged from near the end of the street. A car was coming around the bend quickly. It was late and the driver was unfocused and tired. He slid his thumb over the glowing screen of his phone as he tried to put on the song he wanted to hear. Occasionally, he would glance up at the road to make sure he wasn't drifting. Eleanor's hand finally connected with the rabbit's velvety fur. An instant later, the animal hurled its head around and sunk its teeth into her fleshy palm. She shrieked from the pain and surprise. Eleanor was unaware of the headlights drawing ever closer to her, too involved in her newfound injury to see them. She fell backward and began to weep. The driver of the car was still looking for his next song when he heard a loud thunk. He ripped his gaze away from his phone and looked up into his rear view to see what had made the noise. In the mirror, he saw a rabbit in a heap covered in shadow. All he could make out was a smear of red and some locks of blonde hair. Then he caught the unmistakable sight of a pink helmet. He gasped an obscenity, and then with crazed, fearful eyes put the pedal to the floor and sped away. Eleanor whimpered and tried to call out, but she found no breath in her lungs. She tried to stand, but found nothing but a furious pain unlike anything she had ever experienced. Ellie raised her hand to her forehead and felt a warm, thick liquid. She brought it in front of her eyes, and the red viscera slipped from her fingers onto her pajamas before the whole world went dark. The end. Thank you for joining me for this reading. Stay safe out there and stay spooky.